Hey everybody, this is Josh,
And this is Dean.
and here we are again with another installment of Finding an Agent. And I want to start off by encouraging everyone to like and subscribe and leave us a comment below. And with that, I guess we'll get started. And I'll go ahead and kick off with what I've been up to this week. And I'll say up front, it hasn't been a whole lot. I said last week that I'd finished the story that I was working on, came in at pretty close to 13,000 words. And so this week I spent time trying to get started revising on that story. And I didn't get a whole lot of revising done because I was pretty overwhelmed with a lot of legal work this week. And that was pretty much where most of my energy and attention was this week. So I didn't get a lot done on the writing front. Dean, how about you?
I basically proceeded with my outline, and I've gotten to the point where I've got, I'd say about 50 to 75% of it written or outlined, I'm sorry, but I'm having trouble coming up with more story because I don't think it's going to be long enough. My estimate, I can tell based on, number of scenes I have in my outline, which we can get into in a second, that I looks like I have about 20, 30, maybe 40,000 words. And to get a novel, you really need at least about 80,000 to have a commercial chance at a novel. So I'm going to have to really think about coming up with more story. And there's somewhat of a tension there because I've kind of said what I think the story needs to say. And I think I'm almost going to have to add in subplot to kind of pad it out a little bit. And you kind of, maybe that's not great, because it's like it's almost like you're padding it, but at the same time, you got to get up to a commercial length. So, but I think I've come up with an idea for additional story that will be a good story and will be entertaining. So
Well, that's good. And is this one that you're working on, is this more in the vein of like a mystery novel? You'd mentioned in the past that
it's a mystery crime novel, and it's set in contemporary times. So
all right. Yeah, that's cool. You'd mentioned in the past that that you'd been reading more mysteries and that you wanted to try to write in that area. So,
yeah, it definitely has some appeal to it.
all right. Well, I think from that, we're going to transition over. And this week, we wanted to kind of follow up on something that we talked about last week. Last week, we talked about kind of our writing process and our approach to writing short stories and kind of the dichotomy between whether you're a person who outlines or a person that writes more by the seat of your pants. And that was in the short story context. So this week we wanted to kind of follow up and talk about that same issue, but in the context of a longer work like a novel. And so I think Dean and we have a little bit different approaches from short story to novel. So Dean, you want to start off with that?
Sure. So the way I outline is a little bit unusual. And I got the idea from an author. I read his book, and unfortunately, I don't think I have the book where I learned this, but his name is Jack Bickham. And this is one of his novels from 1989. As you can see, it's a Cold War spy thriller type novel. And I basically got it because I had read one of his books on fiction writing, and I was curious to see like how he actually wrote fiction. I think he's passed away, but so I read this novel basically to see how he implements what he was describing. And what he recommended was that you write in terms of scenes and structure. And he says that most novels are scenes and sequels. And so he says most novels consist of the following. You have a scene where it's like the character does something, interacts with someone, and they usually don't 100% get whatever it is they want, or they even lose some. And the reason they don't get 100% of what they want, or they even end up in a worse off position, is because he says that builds dramatic tension. And so like the character goes to the store and wants to buy chocolate ice cream. Well, he would say, well, you can have the character go to the store and either they're completely out of ice cream, in which case he doesn't get any ice cream at all, or he can't get chocolate ice cream. He can get vanilla ice cream. And he says, so you either completely deny the character whatever he wants, or it's a yes, but. So it's like, yes, you can get ice cream, but it's vanilla, not chocolate, which is what you wanted. And he says you basically build up with scenes like that until the end, and then all of those problems have been built up, and then they kind of he solves those problems at the end, and that builds up dramatic tension. So those are scenes. And then he said the other major element of every novel is what he calls a sequel, which is basically the emotional reaction, the thinking about that previous scene or another scene, and how that character reacts to it or thinks about it. So like after he's gone to the store and he wasn't able to get chocolate ice cream, but he got vanilla ice cream, the character is going to be like walking out of the store and saying, man, I couldn't get chocolate ice cream. I only got this vanilla. You know, what am I going to do now? And then he might go, okay, well, you know, there's this other store over here that has chocolate syrup. I'll go get that, and then I can make some chocolate ice cream. And so you see he's reacting emotionally based on his values and his needs and thinking about what he's going to do next. And then that sets up another scene, which is he goes to the other store to buy the chocolate syrup or whatever. And so that he says, Bickham basically says those are your two major elements of every story, which is a scene and a sequel, the action and then the reaction, basically.
So that's kind of the plot structure or approach that propels you through writing the story.
Right. And then he recommends, and this is what I use, you write scenes on note cards like these. And basically you write out every scene, and then at the end you've got your story, because you've got, you know, every major scene worked out. And so it's like an outline, whereas a traditional outline is more like, you know, Roman numeral 1, this happens, Roman numeral 2, which is fine. And I've done that before in the past too, but I started using this technique for various reasons, and I've just stuck with it. And so this is my outlining technique, is just to write each scene on these note cards.
So when you write your scenes out on the note cards, then I guess that gives you some flexibility. If you need to revise how the story's flowing, that lets you manipulate the scenes a little bit to make them fit optimally. Is that what you do?
Yeah, and what I discard a lot of scenes. Like I'll write a scene and then I'll discard it, or I'll change it. And I end up usually with a lot of discarded note cards in relation to the number of note cards that constitute my outline for the novel. And yeah, you can. And then the other convenient thing about note cards is I tend to lay them out, you know, sequentially. And you're like, okay, well that, and there's usually some scenes that are optional, like chronologically they could happen at this point or they could happen at another point. And maybe depending on how you want to tell the story, you're going to say, well, that could happen here, but I think it would also work well here. And then obviously there's certain things that are like cause and effect. You have to have, you know, he fires the gun and then in the next scene you've got a dead body. Well, obviously the gun getting fired has to happen before you've got the dead body. So, you know, there's some scenes that are mandatory in terms of their chronology, but then there's other scenes you can arrange based on how you want to arrange the story and what's going to be a good dramatic presentation.
So that's the approach that Dean's been using, I think, since you started writing novels. Is that right?
Since I started writing novels, yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Before that, I did the traditional just outline on a piece of paper.
And you're currently working on your third novel, is that right? Or is this your fourth?
I think this is number 3. Yeah, I think this is number 3.
Okay. So that's obviously worked pretty well for Dean. Now, I'll talk a little bit about what I do. And what I do is different from the way Dean does it. And I'll say that you just have to find what works for you. And what works for one person might or might not work for another person. But whatever approach you take, as long as you stick, you know, with that and you develop, you know, that and you get familiar with it, then you can do well with it. And so for me, when I started researching like how to kind of outline and plan my novel, well, let me go back a little bit. So I'll say this: like I mentioned last week, when I write a short story, I very much go by the seat of my pants. And when I decided I was going to start writing a novel, the idea for that novel had been bouncing around in my head for 2 or 3 years before I started it. And so when I sat down and I started writing it by the seat of my pants, just like I would do a short story. And I thought I could do that. And there are people who do that. In fact, I think Stephen King does that. I don't think Stephen King outlines. So I started out that way, and I probably got about 6,000 words down or so. And I realized that I was getting pretty lost in the weeds and didn't really have a good direction on where I was going. And so I decided this was not going to be an efficient exercise for me. I could finish this novel, and when I got done with it, it would be a pretty unwieldy manuscript with lots of little tangents and things that may or may not go anywhere. And I realized pretty quickly, I've got to tighten up this approach, or else I'm going to get very discouraged and I'm not going to like the final product. So I went and I did a lot of reading and a lot of research. And like Dean read what Jack Bickham had to say, and that clicked with him and that worked for his approach. The one that I came across that really seemed to kind of click with the way that I think, I guess, is the best way to put it, is there's a gentleman named Larry Brooks who has, I think he's written some books and he has a website, and his thing is called Story Fix. But he kind of outlines his approach to novel writing, and he's also written books as well. But his approach to outlining a novel and writing a novel based on that outline is to kind of compare it to a movie structure, in that you have different like major acts within the larger body of work. And he sets forth an outline structure that's very similar to how a movie's done, where you have a beginning and a middle and an end, and he kind of goes from there. And I kind of used what he said as kind of a jumping off point, and then I kind of tailored it to what worked best for me. And essentially what works best for me for writing a novel is I'll have a kind of a general idea of what I want this main character to be and what the major conflict is that he's going to be facing. And then I'll decide what I want the resolution to be to that conflict. And so I'll put down kind of at the beginning of the outline who it is, what's his conflict, and then I'll kind of put down at the end what's going to be the resolution. And then I'll try to think of something in the middle that's going to be kind of my midpoint, turning point, what have you, that's going to be like the big dramatic issue in the middle of the book that's going to keep people interested and kind of shift the focus. And you want to have, something big and interesting happen in the middle. And so I'll kind of have these three main markers. And then I'll start plotting my scenes to get me from, so if A is the beginning of the book and Z is the resolution, and then we've got like M in the middle here, then, I'll start figuring out like, okay, what's going to be the plot and the scene that's going to drive my main character from A to M? And then what's going to be the catalyst to get him from M to Z? And so it's almost an act of reverse engineering to fill in those plots. If this is the beginning of the book, what's going to be the necessary flow of events that's going to come out of this initial instigating incident? And then once I kind of get to the end of the flow of that initial thing, okay, what's going to happen next that's going to lead me back to this middle element of the book? And then once I get to the middle element of the book, how's that going to play out? And that's going to be, kind of what leads me away from that. And those scenes that I fill in that are going to naturally flow from that event are going to naturally carry me closer to the resolution that I want to have, or the climax. And so once I work out kind of the scenes that are going to flow from that central part of the book, then I start building towards the resolution. And so it's like a reverse engineering process to where I start filling in these scenes and I start filling in these gaps. And then I do put in one or two subplots in there that I have to strategically place, at proper points in the story that kind of keep that flowing. And those subplots, I try to make sure that those subplots are important to the story. They either inform on the main character, or else they help drive the main character along the central plot line. And so for me, I wouldn't say that it's formulaic by any stretch, but it's definitely a mechanism of putting in signposts and then filling in the scenes that take me from one signpost to the next until I get to the end.
And do you just do a traditional outline format, like on a piece of paper, and like, scene kind of thing?
I kind of do. I kind of, but it's kind of like the way I was laying it out just then. I'll do more like a traditional outline, and I'll go ahead and write out like a 2 or 3 sentence synopsis of the instigating incident, and then I'll write out the last bullet point in the outline of what's going to be the climax and the resolution, and then I'll fill in what I want that middle incident to be, and then I'll start plugging in. But yes, yeah, it is pretty much in an outline form and like that.
Yeah, and I think the thing that you said there, reverse engineering, is a good way of putting it. I think, and I do this too, and I've done this since I seriously started trying to write fiction of any length, was coming up with a conflict and a resolution before anything else. In other words, my central conflict and then the resolution of that conflict. And I got that from, and I'm sure she, got it. She wrote for Hollywood from Ayn Rand, and she wrote a book on how to write fiction. And basically that was one of the things she talked about, was coming up with your climax and then, working towards that climax and thinking about it, like you said, it's like reverse engineering, where you've got that resolution of the conflict, and then you can kind of work backwards from there.
This kind of goes into something that I've mentioned before, which writing a novel was much harder work than what I thought it would be when I first started writing. And there is a lot of work that goes into it, because that reverse engineering, you've got to think about all those things. And now, like Dean said, you can't just adhere hard and fast to your outline. Your story is going to evolve, and as you're writing it, you're going to realize like some things didn't necessarily work out the way you thought they would, and the logical conclusion to one conflict is going to maybe alter your outline a little bit, and that's normal. So you've got to allow yourself some flexibility, but also having some skeletal structure there within which you're working also kind of keeps you from getting too far out in the weeds with some of your tangential storylines or things that happen. But making sure that everything, like with me, it's like I try to go back and I make sure that every single scene in that book in some way informs on the main plot line and helps drive my protagonist towards the end resolution. And going back and cleaning that up and making sure that everything is where it's supposed to be and the way you want it to be. And then sometimes you get done writing the book and you realize, well, okay, I've got to go back and I got to fix some things for consistency's sake, or there's something that I mentioned in, page 150 that I can't just drop that on the reader out of the blue. So you got to go back and you got to go plant that seed back on page 35 or something, so it makes sense and it doesn't just look like some Deus Ex Machina thing that you threw in at the end. And so when you get done, you still got a lot of work to do, but I found that outlining in that way and that reverse engineering process works pretty well for me.
Yeah, and what I wanted to add is, and I get into this like with the thing that I'm writing right now or outlining right now, is you don't want to also kind of get paralyzed by your outline. I think the concept of analysis paralysis can apply. I think you write that outline and you get a fairly good structure of where you think things are going to go, but you don't get too, I guess especially as I've done more writing, is don't get too hung up on the outline and having it be perfect, because the reality is once you start writing, you're probably going to think of things, because it becomes more real and tangible at that point, and the characters become more real and tangible in the situations, and you're probably going to think of things and want to make revisions to the outline. So I wouldn't let yourself get paralyzed to the point that you never get to actually writing. And I have problems. I struggle with that myself. I tend to have analysis paralysis where I'm wanting to have a perfect outline. But I think if you keep in mind, like you said, the two major things are a central conflict and a resolution of that central conflict. Try to think of those, at least have those worked out at the beginning.
Yeah, and there are people that do write novels by the seat of their pants and don't outline at all. For someone who can keep all of that straight in their head, I have to admire them. I have a hard time with that.
Yeah, and you kind of get into a philosophical debate at points, I think, about that, which is they say they're not writing with an outline, but is the outline just in their head? And is that really not writing with an outline? And then, and I'm not gonna, if something works for somebody, then that's great, bully for them. This seems to work for my mind. But I will say, like Stephen King, you mentioned, I think he claims he doesn't write with an outline at all. And I will say the one thing, and we've noted this before, is he has trouble ending a book, and maybe for that very reason. Like he doesn't really have an ending in mind when he starts, and so he may have trouble with that.
Yeah, I wonder if that's true as well. And I've read his book on writing, and it's called On Writing, and I think that's a great book for anyone who likes to write, whether you like to write horror or not. It's a really good insight into a very successful author's approach. But he does talk about his process on writing, and I think it's in that book. If it's not in that book, it's something else that I've seen from him where he talks about his novel Under the Dome. He says that, like many of us, that story kind of started with just an initial thought that he thought was really cool of where this dome came down. And he said he wrote the first few pages of that like way back in the 70s. And I want to say he said he wrote the first few pages of that before he even wrote The Stand or anything. And he had this idea because I think it's a gopher or a hedgehog or something that's like scurrying down the side of a road or something, and the dome comes down and it like cuts this little thing in half, and like one half of it's on one side of the dome and it's just like perfectly like bisected.
Mhm.
And he wrote that scene a long time ago. And this is kind of going to what Dean was saying about how I don't know that he always starts with a conflict, or maybe he has a conflict, but he certainly doesn't seem to have a climax and a resolution in mind. And so in this instance, I guess he had the conflict of having the dome come down and what was going to unfold within the dome. But I don't think he really had a good plot beyond that. And so when he wrote that book, that Under the Dome, I think is a great example of Stephen King having a really good story that goes on for about 800 pages, and then he didn't have a good ending for it. The ending for that book is pretty horrible.
Yeah, and he is the master, and like he wrote many stories and novels that just captured my imagination as a kid. And like the Under the Dome concept is a good example of that, because as soon as I saw that book in the bookstore, I was like, oh, that is such a cool concept. What happens when this town gets, in this impenetrable dome? And the same thing with like the mist. I mean, that's just a cool concept. What if a bunch of people are stuck in a store and there's this mist and with monsters in it, and now they got to like, what are they going to do? How are they going to survive? Stand. What if a worldwide plague wipes out 99% of the human race? I mean, those are all just like, as a kid especially and a teenager, like those cool scenarios just captured my imagination. And so like he is just really great at coming up with those. But then yeah, like sometimes the ending, you're like The Stand, okay,
Yeah. And I think you touched on something really important. All of those things started with a what if scenario.
yeah, or
And
wouldn't it be cool if this happened, kind of thing.
yeah, and all of us who write in the speculative fiction realm,
Yeah,
I think all of our stories kind of start with a what if.
yeah,
But you got to have more than a what if, and you've got to have a conflict and a resolution to it. And I don't know, Stephen King, man, he can, like I said, he is a master storyteller. There's no question, and I'm not even really in a position to make a judgment because he's like so far beyond me in storytelling capability. But yeah, it's long been discussed that he could improve upon his endings.
yeah. And I'm in the same way. Like, I mean, Stephen King obviously has had enormous success and I haven't. So it's a little, I don't want to appear, I guess, like hypocritical or anything in criticizing him. And like I said, when I was younger, his novels and stories really captured my imagination. But yeah, I've noticed that, and I've heard other people say that like the endings sometimes just aren't satisfactory. And like I said, it's a little, almost feels hypocritical for me to criticize someone without success, but that's what I've noticed.
Yeah. And of course, the other thing that I'll throw in here too is with Stephen King over time, especially since the election in 2000, he's gotten much more political with his writings.
Yeah, or
And
he's just he got on Facebook and shit, and people realized
yeah,
how political he was. He may have just always been that way, and you just didn't notice it because you never heard from him.
but I think even within the plots of his novels, he's worked in more political elements. Like with Under the Dome, he said that when he first originally wrote that opening scene back in the 70s, he really didn't know where he was going to go with that story. And it wasn't until the Bush administration that he kind of got the plot idea for what he really wanted to do there. And so what he did was he made the dome come down, and he basically had what went on inside the dome to be kind of a microcosm of what was going on in the United States
Yeah.
from his point of view with the Bush administration.
Yeah.
And so he set up the town structure with these like weird, like over the top despot type, or at least one of them who was supposed to be like the Dick Cheney guy. And then he had another guy that was like the George Bush guy. And he basically structured everything that was going on under the dome the way he saw America under the Bush administration.
That sounds very ham-handed. Like, I never read it, but just like trying to make that all just a metaphor for the Bush administration seems.
Yeah, and he has openly admitted, like you can go find videos on YouTube where he discusses that and says that's what he did. And so that's not even speculation on my part. That's absolute fact. And that's okay. I read the book and I thought the book was pretty interesting, pretty entertaining and stuff. And when I was reading it, I don't think I knew what he was doing there, and I didn't really put it together, and I didn't really care. So it's one of those things that's like maybe something that you see in real life sparks an idea for a story and it ends up being a great story, and you don't realize that someone's trying to send a political message to you. But then when you hear, you know, what his inspiration was for that, and then you're like, oh, okay, yeah, I can kind of see what he did there. But
Yeah.
honestly, I don't really care that much. Like, I read stuff from all over the spectrum, and as long as it's not, you know, hugely negative or disparaging towards me and my way of life, I don't really care. Everyone's entitled to their opinion. But it was a very entertaining story. Just the ending of it was just beyond ridiculous. But
yeah, I didn't read the novel at all. I just saw some of the, what was it, Amazon.com, or, you know, the series on Amazon or wherever it was. And I watched like the first season of it, and then I think my free subscription ended. I mean, the premise was cool, and I don't know how close it was to the novel. And like I said, when I saw the title Under the Dome and I kind of read the back, I was like, oh, that's, you know, once again, you know, Steve did it again. You know, that's an awesome premise for, you know, that the 13-year-old boy in me, you know, loves that notion. So I guess that's like every time it's just like his novels and everything, a lot of them just like really appeal to the 13-year-old boy in me.
yeah. Yeah, he definitely has an knack for storytelling, that's for sure. Well, anyway, I think that's probably pretty good outline of how I outline.
How we
so
outline.
I think I'll end there. Yeah. Do you have anything else you wanted to
add? No, I think that's it.
All righty. Well, I guess we'll wrap up on that note, and hope everybody has a good week, and like and subscribe and leave us a comment, and we'll see you next time.
Everybody take care.
Sorry, I got to start over.
I don't know why that's backwards. It's really weird.
Ah, shit. All right.
We'll get better at this as we go, I guess. And,
you know, what's going into the sausage here?
There's definitely some reflection off my head. Yeah, I may end up in federal prison.